let's continue into wireless LANs. This is way more interesting than WANs. Okay?
Not much.
No, trust me, it's way better. Way more excited about this than I am with WANs.
like
WANs are awful.
Do we have to do that little thing like we did last
No.
semester?
No. Unless you just want to recreationally. But I think you have the concepts from it, so we don't need to do that again. Go ahead and log into Socrative. We're going to talk about wireless LANs, how to deploy them, and how to secure them. So there's two categories of wireless LANs. We have the ad hoc LAN. What does ad hoc mean? One of those things we hear all the time, but we don't actually stop to look it up.
It's a relay on another connection.
It's Latin for this.
There you go. That's what I was looking for. It's Latin for this. Okay? Ah, it's in my notes. I was Googling it. It's right there. So it just means it's for this instance, and then we're going to tear it down, and that's it. So that's what ad hoc means. So the devices are communicating directly with each other. There's not any infrastructure built. If there is an infrastructure built, we would call that an infrastructure wireless LAN. So they communicate with other devices, wired or wireless, through some sort of router or access point that's been set up there for that purpose. So that's what an infrastructure wireless LAN is. Depending on the situation, you'll probably see both in your career. Most of what I've seen is probably something that's been set up beforehand for the purposes of providing wireless all the time. The router is the magical device that gives us a wireless signal. So we're going to use this wireless signal as a gateway, and it's our gateway to get out to the internet, which we've talked about in fundamentals exhaustively. Our router is our layer 3 device that gets us off the local LAN into another network, which in this case is probably going to be the internet. So this little router, this magical box, there's lots of things that happen inside of it. And when you look at it, it serves as a wireless access point. Look at the antennas. They're the thing that's sending off this wireless signal for other people to pick up. There's a switch in it. Here's the switch. It's just a tiny 4-port switch, so you can have wired and wireless connections within the same device, as long as you don't have more than 4. Right? There's often a firewall implemented into them. It depends how much money you end up paying for it and what router you get. But a lot of times there's access control lists and stuff that you can implement into it. And then maybe a cable or DSL modem. So sometimes you'll get your modem from your ISP and connect it to this. Sometimes they'll give you a magical box that serves as the modem and the router. It kind of depends on what they set you up with when you get in with that company. And I'm sure we've talked about the pros and cons of having a modem router combo versus a modem and a router separately. Have we spoken about that? I'm trying to think if this was this class or not. Justin, do you remember that? No? Okay. So,
What was the question?
the pros and cons of having a modem and a router combo versus having 2 separate devices. So if you have a modem router combo from your ISP, it's probably locked down where you can't change anything on it. And they're going to have, you know, your key to get to the wireless network is this long, and it's like random numbers and letters, and you can't remember it, and it kind of becomes a big issue when you want to connect something new to it. If you have a modem and a router that are separate, they're always going to blame all the problems on the router because they don't want to fix it because it's not theirs. So there's just a couple things that to consider when you're trying to pick, well, should I go with what they give me or should I have my own modem and router? I know at home we have the modem from the cable company and our own separate router.
Is it like crushing like everyone as far as like rating goes?
What?
Nighthawk. The Nighthawk.
Say that again? The Nighthawk?
Nighthawk.
Isn't that the one that has the firmware thing
Yeah.
in it still?
Yeah.
Where it resets itself?
Yeah.
Because my husband wanted to get one of those and we started researching. I'm like, maybe not until I get that worked out.
But like, you can stop it. Like you can, like, they figured out something you can do with it. Because as far as I know, all I've heard is good things about it. Like,
Yeah.
Lloyd has one. And like,
Yeah, the
He-
Nighthawk router, if y'all haven't seen this, it's kind of it's a beast.
he does nothing but brag about it.
It kind of looks kind of like a piece of art to me. Yeah, there's one of them. The dual band router, it's extremely fast and has a whole lot of capabilities to it.
You can also get a Nighthawk modem now also.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. And if I remember correctly, see what Best Buy sells it for.
A lot higher.
$190.
Oh, it's cheaper than, well, cheaper than
Yeah,
Walmart.
that's not bad.
That's not bad.
No.
Cheaper than Walmart.
For a good one, no, it's not bad. That's the kind of thing you don't skimp on.
Yeah.
You know, that's the kind of thing it's okay to invest a little money in a router. Okay, so when we're looking at a basic topology of a wireless LAN, so we've got our wireless router that's working, it's sending off signals to the laptop and the smartphone. And then we've got a wired portion of the router that's plugged into an individual wired PC. So we have this kind of mixed environment. With that comes its own set of troubleshooting and its own set of issues that we will have to address. So a wireless access point is going to interconnect the wired LAN with the wireless LAN. So it's not connecting to networks, it's just saying, okay, well here's an access point that I'm going to plug into the router to maybe extend my wireless network to a place where it's not getting signal right now. And not all routers are wireless routers. Some routers are just routers, which we don't see those a whole lot, but that is a possibility as well. So the access point connects to the wired LAN, and the wireless devices connect to that access point so that they can get signal. So here's an example of an access point. So we don't have a wireless router in this instance, we have a wired router. But we have an access point that's still going to provide that access signal. So to me that just looks like another thing that will break, but that's just me. All of these wireless components are going to have different kinds of antennas attached to them. And the coverage is going to be based on the type of antenna that's used. So most home and small business wireless access points have fixed antennas. But when you get to a larger network with different kinds of antennas in it, you're going to see a little bit of variation. But the antennas, what they do is determine the distance. So the bigger and more expensive antennas might radiate out further. The coverage pattern, for example, does it radiate out in all directions, or does it go to a specific path? And playing that Cisco wireless game, we kind of saw the different kinds of antennas and how far they would go and stuff. If you were in my fundamentals class, we did that last time. The environment, you can have indoor or outdoor antennas. There are some instances where you would need an outdoor antenna. That kind of sounds silly. But what if you were a concert stadium or something and you wanted to provide wireless access? You're going to need antennas placed up top that are going to be able to withstand the weather. And interference with other access points is another thing that can determine what kind of antenna that we need. So there's two general types of antennas. The first one is the omnidirectional. So it radiates out at equal levels in all directions. So it's kind of a 360, but really it's kind of spherical in the way that it radiates out. Then we've got the unidirectional. So the unidirectional focuses the power in a specific direction. So in this building, we have an omnidirectional antenna, and that antenna reaches far enough that it reaches all the floors, and we don't have to have any other access points plugged in for all the people to be able to get wireless access. When we would use a unidirectional antenna, is if we had two buildings that needed to wirelessly communicate with each other that were within a short range. For whatever reason we can't run wires, we would use unidirectional, so this one would point to the right to this access point, this one would point to the left to that access point, and they would be able to communicate with each other in that way. Another characteristic of wireless is frequencies and channels. So wireless is the 802.11 standard. So the .11 is the standard for how all wireless works, and then we have different specifications underneath that to learn about. So one of the characteristics is the frequency. So as far as where wireless lands on the spectrum, we have the 2.4 gigahertz range and the 5 gigahertz band range. Within each one of those are channels in which those devices operate. There are lots of different things that work wirelessly, but we're talking about wireless data communications with computers. Those are the two bands that we need to focus on, the 2.4 and the 5 gigahertz. Some of them are used for like industrial purposes, scientific research purposes, medical. So maybe medical devices, they operate on a different band. So there's no confusion about where that data is supposed to be sent and received. So to avoid interferences, these nearby access points should use different channels so that the data doesn't overlap. There is a best practice for that I'll talk about in just a second, but the point being, you don't want wireless to go from channel 1 to 5 because this channel would overlap and the data might get crossed. So you want everything to be separate. Just like your cable television, you have different frequencies on the same wire, and if you didn't, you'd have channels that look like they bled over in each other. You might have ghosting of one channel over the other. So you want everything to be separate. So the magic number for separating our channels is 5. So anytime you're asked a question about channel separation, there's an access point on this channel, there's an access point on this channel. What should the other one be? There's 3 access points. You want 5 separation from each one. So what that typically looks like is channel 1, 6, and 11. So there's 5 channels between those channels to ensure that the separation is ideal and there's not going to be any crossing over of those channels. If we wanted to know where our Wi-Fi was and what channels things were configured on, let's say we're walking into a big building and there's not really any documentation as far as how the wireless is set up. We just know there's wireless everywhere. You can get things like the air magnet you can walk through the building and it will graph, hey, this is where this access point is, here's what channels it's connected to, here's the frequencies, and you can just kind of walk through the building and then have a nice map of where all this stuff lands. The real fancy stuff, you can import a floor plan into it and then kind of have documentation that you built. Now these things are crazy expensive. They're a couple, $3,000, but professional IT companies, they might have something like this just for this purpose. This also helps you find points of interference. The little commercial on here is funny because there's a woman popping popcorn in her cubicle. And so he walks through and sees, oh, the microwave is a source of interference. We need to get that out of here. But just in practical application, this is the kind of tool you would use. There's also iPhone apps, I believe, that are free that do the same thing. So you can walk around with your iPhone and see what network, does it have passwords on it, what the frequencies are. So that can be kind of interesting, especially if you're looking for free Wi-Fi somewhere. You know? So we know that wired connections uses carrier sense multiple access collision detection, where it sends out the jam signal if it sees something else is being transmitted on the line, and it waits, it backs off, and then it tries again. So wireless has to have a way to avoid collisions as well. But in wireless we call it carrier sense multiple access collision avoidance. So basically the device listens to see if there's a transmission. If the channel is clear, it transmits. It's really similar to Ethernet, it's just called something different. So instead of detecting a collision, it's listening first to try to avoid a collision. So that's the difference between the two.
So then, but then the collisions will still occur though, right?
They could, yeah.
Both are listening and it's clear, they both
They
send.
might.
So what happens, so it's just not.
Well, the data, yeah, I mean, it's going to get lost for sure.
Yeah.
But if you have the acknowledgements and stuff going back and forth, you'll know the data gets lost.
Right.
Yeah, but that can definitely still happen. We might be talking about milliseconds apart, so maybe it doesn't make a difference, but maybe it does. If you're trying to do a bunch of packets in a row, sure. That can definitely still happen. And there's, yeah, a little bit about that. If there's no acknowledgement, then it tries again. Same thing. Some ways that wireless transmits, here's where we get like really technical. The direct sequence spread spectrum moves the data over all the frequencies. The frequency hopping hops between different frequencies, and the orthogonal frequency division multiplexing tries to combine different transmissions over the data streams over time. What you need to know about these: A, recognize these acronyms so they don't confuse you with them and put them in another question. But for security purposes, you use OFDM when possible. Now it's a slower way to transmit wireless, but because it's modulating over different frequencies over and over, it's really difficult to catch packets and be able to decipher them or pick them apart. So as far as which one is more secure, it's OFDM, because the packets are harder to catch because they're kind of spread all over. There's a little information about the different wireless standards.
Connecting a wireless device for the first time, simply choosing a random frequency and plugging it into the network is probably not going to be your best course of action. You may find that you're conflicting with other devices and other frequencies that are in use, and therefore the performance of your wireless network is going to suffer. The first thing you should do is to perform a site survey. You need to understand exactly what frequencies are in use and how you could best configure your access point to work optimally in that environment. There are many different tools you can use to help find all of these different access points. It might be a free piece of software or something commercial that you can purchase, or you're getting a full-blown spectrum analyzer and really trying to understand exactly what frequencies are in use at that location. Once you have that information, you can then start determining what particular frequencies are open or available, or which ones are not being used as much as other frequencies. This way you can plan where you want to put an access point and then decide what frequencies should be used by that particular access point. Of course, not everybody is going to follow this formal process when they start setting up their wireless network, and if there are other organizations in the same general area as you, you may find that they are now conflicting with your network configuration. So you may want to plan to do ongoing site surveys. Come back every month or every 3 months or every 6 months and make sure that the wireless environment is running as optimally as possible. One thing you can do is to perform something like this, a heat map. This is a piece of software I downloaded that allowed me to walk around a particular area. You could even put the diagram of the area as the background, and as you move, it knows exactly where you are in relation to the access point, and it can start to show you in color view exactly where the signal is very good and where the signal is very bad. And you can walk inside of your building, outside of your building, and get a better understanding of exactly where the frequencies are in use for your wireless network. There are so many different wireless frequencies that we use for our wireless network. It is a subset of the 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz frequency ranges, and they are very standardized for all of the different wireless types. The IEEE standards will dictate what frequencies are in use, and governments also control exactly how much of those particular frequencies are available in a particular country. We are going to look at 802.11a, 802.11b, G, N, and AC. There are a lot of different standards in between that, but those are the main wireless standards that you'll run into, and you need to understand what frequencies each one of these particular standards use. You'll need to understand, therefore, that each one of these standards uses different speeds. There's going to be different distances that are supported because of the frequencies and the type of modulation in use. They're using different channels, which is how we block out the different frequencies in all of these different standards. And the frequencies themselves are controlled by governmental agencies, which may limit exactly which frequencies you can use in a particular country. Let's look at how 802.11b uses the 2.4 gigahertz range. 802.11b uses a modulation type over this wireless network of direct sequence spread spectrum, or DSSS. This is how it sends the wireless signal from one device to another over this 802.11b network. It uses this mechanism called chipping. It takes a certain chunk of data, chips it, and sends it out over a number of different frequencies. It's a very predefined order. As this information is being sent, it's expected to be received in a very predefined order on the other side. That is the spread spectrum part of the DSSS. There are generally 14 channels that you can use. These channels correlate to very specific 2.4 gigahertz frequencies. For example, channel 1 is 2412 megahertz. Channel 11 is 2462 megahertz. So there's a gap between these different channels, and they overlap themselves quite a bit. Each channel is about 22 megahertz wide, and they are spaced at 5 megahertz intervals. So by simply looking at that, you can see there is extensive overlap for each one of these frequency ranges. That's why we have certain channels that do not overlap. With 2.4 gigahertz on 802.11b, channel 1, channel 6, and channel 11, for instance, do not overlap with each other, at least not here in the United States. In the US, we can't use any frequencies above that channel 11, but it can go all the way up to channel 14, which may be in use in your particular country. So you need to look at the different frequencies that are being used, and what you'll generally find is if it is an 802.11b network, it is running on channel 1, channel 6, or channel 11. The 2.4 gigahertz range is also used by 802.11g and 802.11n. It uses a different modulation type to send the information, though. It uses orthogonal frequency division multiplexing, or OFDM. This is the same modulation type we use for 802.11a. It's using the same frequencies as we were just looking at in the 802.11b. It's just using that different modulation type of OFDM instead of using DSSS. So if we start looking at the overlap of channels, it's exactly the same for 802.11g and 802.11n. We have channels 1, channel 6, and channel 11. If it needs to use slower speeds, it effectively reverts back to the 802.11b mechanism. So you may see also modulations of DSSS if you're using these slower speeds on 802.11g or 802.11n. In a later video, we'll look at the details of speeds between all of these different wireless standards. But one important thing to know is that 802.11n provides for much higher speeds than 802.11g. And it does that in part by using much more of the frequency. You can see that 802.11n uses a 40 megahertz wide channel. You can see it's about twice as wide as what we saw with 802.11b or 802.11g. And you can really only have one particular frequency so that you're not overlapping with any others in this particular frequency range. So channel 3 is generally what you'll see for 802.11n, but of course you can adjust things depending on what other frequencies may be in use in your particular area. Here's a better view of all these non-overlapping channels. You can see with 802.11b is our channel 1, our channel 6, channel 11, and then the channel 14 at the very top. These channels are 22 megahertz wide. For 802.11g and n, the channels are 20 megahertz wide, but still we have that non-overlapping channel at channel 1, channel 6, and channel 11. And as I mentioned, 802.11n has twice the size of the channel width at 40 megahertz, so you can have the higher speeds for those 802.11n networks. Another section of frequencies available for our wireless networks are the 5 gigahertz frequencies. We see these being used for 802.11a, 802.11n, and 802.11ac. 5 gigahertz frequencies are not used for 802.11b or g. For 802.11a, we're using dynamic frequency selection to determine what frequencies to use. There are a number of military uses for these 5 megahertz frequencies, so by using DFS, we're able to avoid conflicting with radar that's being used for weather or military satellite use. This is using that same frequency modulation we were looking at before of OFDM. It allows us to send multiple data streams even though we're using a fixed type of bandwidth. There are 23 non-overlapping channels available in this 5 gigahertz range, and of course the availability of the frequencies will differ depending on what country you're in. To get some of these higher speeds in 802.11n, We take advantage of something called MIMO. This stands for multiple input and multiple output. There's a single receiver in 802.11n, but you can have more than one antenna, so you can send and receive on different channels at the same time. You can support up to 4 transmit and 4 receive, so there's 4 separate data streams that can all be communicating at the same time with 802.11n. 802.11ac takes this another step farther with multi-user MIMO or MU MIMO. With multi-user MIMO in 802.11ac, you can have up to 4 separate receivers inside of an access point with multiple antennas on each of those. And with that particular architecture, you're able to get multi-gigabit speeds out of these wireless networks on 802.11ac. There's a large emphasis for backwards compatibility when you start using these wireless networks. That way you can have an older 802.11b device but still have it communicate even though you have an 802.11n access point. It uses a mechanism called high throughput mode to determine how it's going to work and how backwards compatible it's going to be. For 802.11n, this high throughput mode is also called a greenfield mode because it doesn't support any of the legacy devices. You have to have everything running at 802.11n. This is also going to give you the highest throughput for the 802.11n networks because it doesn't have to be the older backwards compatible and slower network communication used in the older standards. If you do have legacy devices, you might want to consider running your 802.11n access point in legacy mode. This is a non-high throughput mode. It uses those 20 megahertz channels, so you're not getting the larger 40 megahertz channels, so you're not going to get the 802.11n speeds. But if you have older equipment that can't run at those higher speeds, this may be a good way to configure your access point at least until you get everyone upgraded. You might also have an option inside your access point for a high throughput mixed mode. And in mixed mode, you're able to run 802.11n and 802.11b and g at the same time. Your N devices are not going to run at the full capabilities of N, and your B and G devices obviously won't run at N speeds either, but this does allow you to have all of those devices running on your network at the same time. With GoodPut, you are defining how fast the application can transfer the information. You're not worried about the network mechanisms or how fast the network is running. You're only interested in knowing the maximum throughput for your application. And when you look at throughput from an application level, we always refer to that as GoodPut.
Okay, so regarding our standards, the ones that we need to know about, A, B, G, N, and AC, AC being the newest one. So when we started creating wireless networks, we actually started with the B standard. We disregarded the alphabet altogether, and we started out with the B standard. So the B standard runs in that 2.4 gigahertz range. It has 11 megabits per second bandwidth speed. It uses the older transmission method, and it doesn't have very much of a range. So we started out with B, hey, at least we have wireless. Then we started figuring out, well, there's some problems with this because there's lots of other things in the 2.4 gigahertz range, which we'll talk about in a second. So then they made the wireless A standard. So the wireless A standard used the 5 gigahertz band. It was faster. It used a different kind of transmission. We didn't really increase our range. In fact, we kind of decreased the outdoor range of the antenna, but it ran on a less crowded network, and it was faster. So there are certain applications where that was needed. After A, then G was created, we went back to that crowded 2.4 gigahertz network. We kept the same speed that we had come up with in A, and we increased our outdoor range just a teeny bit, but so now we had something faster even though it was in the crowded range. So kind of over time they've made things better a little bit as they figure out the standards. What you see in use now is 802.11n. So the thing about that is it can operate in the 2.4, the 5 gigahertz, or both if you're running dual band. So remember concurrent band and dual band, the differences? So dual band is running in one or the other, and concurrent band is running in both. So you can kind of have two different bands, two different wireless networks that you can connect to for those purposes. the speeds went up quite a bit, and our range increased. Channel bonding on wireless N is where you can bond two channels together to form a bigger channel so you can push more data through it. That was one thing that wireless N gave us. Wireless AC is the newer standard on the 5 gigahertz range. The bandwidth has been very much increased with this because of the multiple user MIMO technology, having more than one antenna to send and receive stuff on. So our speeds and stuff like that are similar to N. Now, the reason you need to know this is on the Net Plus, they will ask you questions like, there's a user in this instance, they need this speed and this range. Which of the following wireless standards would they pick? In the real world, you always pick the newest thing, right? As far as CompTIA is concerned, that's the reason why you need to know those. So they need to be on the 2.4 gigahertz range and they need an 11 megabit connection. Which would they choose? In this instance, they would choose B. Okay, so as far as what to expect from the test, that's the kind of stuff you can expect. You don't need to worry about this part so much, but you do need to kind of know your speed and what band it's on. They like to ask lots of interference questions, so we'll talk about those in just a second. When you deploy a wireless LAN, there's a few categories of it. Your IBSS, your independent basic service set, is your ad hoc. There's just a bunch of wireless stuff. There's not really infrastructure set up, so there's not anything to give out wireless devices. It's a for this connection, just for this instance. The basic service set is one wireless LAN with an access point connected to something. One access point, that's it. The extended service set is more than one access point that works together to provide more coverage. So whichever one you're going to need is depending on the size of the building that you're trying to put wireless in, or the area you're trying to put wireless in, whether you need one access point or more than one access point. So when it says that it works together, that means that you can go from one access point to the other without dropping your connection. So if you have access points all the way down the hallway, you can walk and have your phone and keep being on the internet from one end of the building to the other. So that has to be set up. There's special equipment for that. But that's part of the infrastructure that you're building when you're building an extended service set. So here's some graphic example. Your IBSS, you just have two devices connected to each other, and the infrastructure that's established doesn't provide any wireless to those. They're just talking to each other. Then you've got the basic service set. You have one access point that is providing wireless. Then the extended service set, let's say this building, there's no way one access point could provide wireless to all the people that need it. So we have to have more than one, and they have to be configured so that they work together so everybody's on the same network. So that is what an extended service set looks like. So sources of interference with wireless, we have to worry about radio frequency interference. So things that are common office home devices are going to cause interference. We have to be aware of those and know how to counteract them. So anything else wireless LAN is giving off a signal, it could be a source of interference. Cordless phones, baby monitors, anything in the 2.4 gigahertz range or the 5 gigahertz range is going to cause that problem. Baby monitors have been known to be messed up based on that. Microwave ovens, my husband just bought a Steam Link. You'll know what that is? So it's a gaming device. It's like this big, it's really small, but it connects to your Steam account so that you can play video games over your television, but you're playing it from your computer.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so we just bought that and it works great, but computer's here, TV's in the den, Steam Link is in the den, kitchen's in the middle. Every time I turn on the microwave, he loses his connection. Yeah, because of that
So it's
RFI.
just a microwave
So in
outside
that
the-
case, like it seems silly that a microwave would do that, but the microwave is messing up. Every time I do that, his controller stops working. So that still happens. Wireless security systems like camera systems and alarm systems can do that as well. Physical obstacles, things like filing cabinets, they're metal, so they might be a source of interference. Not saying they give off a signal, but saying that they're an obstruction to signal. And another thing is concrete walls. So older buildings especially, they were built much sturdier than what we have built now. So sometimes in an older office building, you have to run wires because you can't run anything wireless because of the interference that's caused by it. So that is another thing to think. Do you need me? No? Okay. Okay. And then signal strength is another issue. So that's why we do a site survey. We walk through with a laptop or a wireless device of some type and then watch to see where the signal drops and where do we need to add something else. When we use more than one access point, we have to figure out the best place to put those. A lot of times, this is on the customer's dime, right? So we have to make sure that we plan really, really well so that we get all the access points and we don't get everything installed and then the customer goes, well, I can't access wireless in this room, or this room. What did I pay you for? Right? So doing those site surveys and stuff becomes really important. Coverage should overlap between access points, and there's a standard for how much they should overlap. Not saying the frequencies overlap, because we still have our 5 as our magic number for that. But when you're looking at placing wireless access points, you want 10 to 15% of coverage overlap. Because if you didn't have overlap, and your graph looked like this, you're going to lose those people, those people, those people, and those people, right? You're going to have holes in the coverage. So that's why you want a little overlap where we don't lose these people in the middle, right? If you have cells of coverage, you might hear the term cells of coverage. It would be something that looked like this. So notice that our 11s are spaced as far apart as they can be, and so are our 6s. So our frequencies are as far apart as possible, so there's not going to be any overlap between frequencies, but we still have coverage in every place that we need it. A wireless access point that's not installed properly could cause some security issues. It's really interesting what people try to do with wireless networks. One of the things that people do is what's called war driving. So people will drive around during the day while everybody's at work, see what access points are open or weak, and then come back at night and jump on the access point with Wireshark or something and see what's going through and possibly get some information from it. So for the people that, hey, I have a wireless router that's 15 years old, it's a wireless B, it still works, why would I change it? That's why you would change it, because now we have more advanced forms of encryption and safer ways to get online. So they will do this war driving, and then on the curb they'll put these little symbols there so that they can remember and come back later, whether it's an open network or it's closed or it's in WEP, because that's our weakest kind of wireless encryption. It's really, really easy to break. So they will put this on the curb, come back to it later, and gather up your traffics through your credit card numbers, your banking passwords, whatever they want. The security cracking that can come with that, they can capture those packets, run an algorithm on it. We know the longer the key is, the more secure it is. If you have a 4-bit key, like WEP does, that's really easy to crack. So just running a computer, hey, figure this out, and it does it, and you're in. The rogue access point, so you set up an access point that people would connect to. So you go sit at McDonald's and you set up an access point, and it's called McDonald's free Wi-Fi, and people connect to it, and then you can see everything that they're doing. So that's why I'm always kind of leery when I go to Starbucks or McDonald's or a place like that and they have free Wi-Fi. I don't ever connect to it because you never know if it's going to be rogue, right? So that's a security issue. It has the same SSID as the real one sometimes. So you might have two networks called McDonald's free Wi-Fi, and one of them is legitimate and the other one's not. So you never quite know what you're getting there. One of the things we can do to secure our wireless LANs is go ahead and assign people, say, figure out what their MAC address is and then filter based on MAC address. So if your MAC address doesn't meet these 5, you can't get on our wireless network. We have our router set up like that at home, and it really ticks our guests off because I don't want them using my internet. So when they come over, they can see the network, but they can't connect to it because they're not put in our router as being able to. Now, if you know how to falsify your MAC address, you can. There's free programs out there to do it. So that's not necessarily foolproof, but it's a good step that doesn't cost anything but a little bit of configuration. You can disable the broadcast of the network name. So it doesn't say, when it pulls up, hey, here's the available networks, it doesn't show up there. So if you're knowledgeable, you can still find the SSID in some cases, but that's going to be, you know, the low-hanging fruit, so to speak. Those are 2 things that you can do to keep yourself from being targeted. In fact, there's a free program. I'm not going to do this, but I'm going to show you the program. It's called Technidium, I guess you could say. So I can pull up my local area connection. There's my MAC address, and I can put whatever MAC address I want it to be. No, I don't want to update. And then say change now down there. And it will fool the computer into thinking that's the actual hardware MAC address, and I can falsify my MAC in that way, and it takes seconds. Or I can just assign a random MAC address to change. So sometimes people, if you're in a coffee shop or something, you only get 30 minutes of Wi-Fi, and they do it based on your MAC address. When your 30 minutes is up, you can just make a new random one and get another 30 minutes free. That's how people do it. This is free, by the way, this program.
What's the name of it again?
Tectanium. 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 So that's something fun.
Yeah, I do it all the time to get in Mumble and Mint and stuff that I've been banned from.
Yeah.
Because those ban on IP. So.
Yeah. The pre-shared key. So the access point and whoever's connecting to it, they need to have the same key so they can talk. The problem with the pre-shared key is if you've got more than like 5 or 10 computers, there's key talk back and forth. It's really difficult to change that key. If something changes, you have to go change it on every individual computer. So there's no central administration, and that can become a problem. 802.1x is a wireless authentication standard, and it's an important one because it's very much used. So each wireless user authenticates with their own credentials. This can be used for wired stuff too, wired or wireless. But here's what it looks like. So there's the supplicant, which is the person that's trying to get on the network. In this instance, they're trying to get through on the wired network. So there's a LAN controller on a wired network. Sometimes that's just a switch that has this programmed into it and set up so that it knows, hey, this person is trying to connect. I need to go check against the authentication server and see if they have access and what they have access to. So instead of having this happen through a computer, it's happening through a device. There's keys and things that are distributed, and we'll talk more about this when we get to the network security chapter. But here is a little bit of information about that.
Another challenge we have is security of our switches and the ports that are on our switches. When you have all of these different ports on a device, anybody can walk into a conference room, they can walk into an empty jack that might be wired up on your network, they can plug in their device, and they might have access to all of the internal resources of your organization. Because of that, there's a type of security called network access control, NAC. You'll sometimes see this referred to as port-based network access control. And what it's really referring to is a standard technology called IEEE 802.1x. The idea is that before you're really allowed access to that switch port and it's turned on and given you access to the network, you first have to authenticate. And that way someone couldn't walk into your conference room, plug in and see your network because they wouldn't have the authentication credentials. It uses some technologies called EAP, EAP, and Radius. This stands for an extensible authentication protocol. It's a very standard way to authenticate on a network. And Radius is a way to store and communicate authentication details like usernames and passwords. That stands for Remote Authentication Dial-In User Service. We'll almost refer to this all the time as EAP or EAP and a Radius server somewhere in your environment. And we're talking about protecting here the physical interfaces of your switch. When somebody talks about port-based network access control, you sometimes have to make sure, are you talking about the physical ports on my switch, or are you talking about TCP and UDP ports? In this particular example for switch port security and 802.1x, we're really talking about physical access to the ports on these switches. You can also, and this is a very good best practice, is to administratively enable and disable ports as they are needed. If a port is not being used, disable it. That way you won't accidentally enable it, and that also means somebody can't walk up to your switch and plug in and get access to your network. You also have switches that have some intelligence built into the ports themselves. If somebody was to get on your network and duplicate MAC addresses on your network in an effort to redirect traffic, your switch can recognize when some of those things occur and stop people from what we call spoofing, or trying to fool the switch into thinking that you are somebody else on your network. And by having these switches look for those types of security issues, you can prevent also someone from stepping in and taking over a session that might already be authenticated. Your switch recognizes, wait a second, that MAC address already exists somewhere else. I'm not going to allow you access onto this switch. Network access control using IEEE 802.1x is a pretty complex set of protocols, and it needs to be. We're providing access to ports on a switch through software, and so there needs to be a lot of checks and balances in between. There's three major components you have to think about with 802.1x. There's something called a supplicant. That is a piece of software that is running on your computer that recognizes how to communicate via 802.1x. There's also something your supplicant will be talking to called an authenticator. And as you might think, that's the device that really is providing a middle ground for authenticating on the network. And then there's something called an authentication server. Your supplicant never really talks directly to the authentication server. Your supplicant on your computer is talking to the authenticator, who's then passing through that information to the authentication server. The conversation goes something like this. When you first connect to a network, you don't have access to the network. You're not able to communicate. You're essentially in a initialization phase where you have no ability to communicate out on the network. And you sit there and you wait. Very often the authentication device that's on the switch, usually it's part of the switch itself, is sending out these requests every so often saying, hey, is there anybody new out there? This is really called an EAP, an EAP request, to find out, has somebody else plugged in lately? And if you have, you might want to let me know that you're here. In fact, that's the next step, is that the supplicant recognizes, oh, somebody's asking for me. Yes, my name's James. I'm here on the network. I'd like to go ahead and start the process of gaining access to the network. The authenticator then lets the authentication server know that, by the way, James is on the network. What would you like to do with this? And the authentication server is now waiting to find out more information from that. So the authenticator asks, hey, James, are you able to talk? Can you communicate on the network? And the authentication server would like to communicate. Well, sure. Here's my credentials. Let me give you information about who I am and how I can communicate on this network. And the authentication server then receives that information from the authenticator that says, hey, James is on the network. Here's his credentials. And maybe this is someone you might want to allow access to the network. The authentication server looks through that information and says, that looks fantastic. James is allowed access to the network. Go ahead, enable some ports, and let him onto the network. And at that point, your machine is allowed access to the ports on your network. Very often the switch is reconfigured to allow access to a particular VLAN or to the VLAN that's specific to you, and now your computer is on the network and able to communicate. It's a relatively complex process, but as I mentioned, it's one that really provides us with a lot of checks and balances and ensures that only the people who are allowed on the network really have access to the network.
Okay, our security standards when it comes to wireless, we have 3. We have WEP, WPA, and WPA2. So WEP was the original one. It has a 40-bit key. It had this initialization vector that got sent with every single frame, and that was the problem. Because the initialization vector was only 24 bits, and you could break that with a computer. So, wouldn't take very long to crack. Like, less than a minute or 2. I mean, very, very short. So that's why we don't use WEP anymore. So WEP is never a good security solution in and of itself. Let me say that. So to fix WEP, well, we came up with WPA2. We used a longer key. We added this thing called message integrity check, which makes sure that the data wasn't modified in transit. If you've taken a security class, that's a man-in-the-middle attack. So that's supposed to keep that from happening. There is an enterprise mode to WPA, which means that they're authenticating before they exchange keys like 802.1x does. So there's an enterprise mode and there's a personal mode, and if you've ever configured a router, you probably saw both of those options there. Unless you've got a radius server or something like that, you would not use enterprise mode. WPA2. We took WPA and we improved it a little bit. So we used my favorite networking acronym. Counter mode with cipher blockchaining message authentication code protocol CCMP. It's my favorite. It's so unnecessarily long with so few letters in the acronym. But that was meant to check the integrity of the message. So we added that to it, and we also allowed the use of AES encryption, which is the most advanced symmetric encryption scheme that we have right now. So we'll talk more about encryption in a future chapter, but that's what WPA2 did for us. So it checks integrity and it allows for better encryption. So go ahead and go to Socrative. And let's kind of see, that's a lot of information, but let's see how the Net Plus would ask it. Because that's always what we're working on, right? So number 1, what type of antenna commonly used in wireless access points and wireless routers in SOHO locations radiates relatively equal power in all directions? Okay. Almost everyone said an omnidirectional, and that is correct. Unidirectional is in one direction. Uni, one, right? But an omni is all directions.
Think of it like this, like an omnivore eats everything.
Eats everything. That's true. Yeah, that's true. All right, when using 2.4 gigahertz band for multiple access points in a wireless LAN located in the United States, which non-overlapping channels would you select? Choose 3. They're never going to ask you about other countries, so don't worry about that.
Why are they using other countries but not here? 14.
I think it's reserved for something here, but I don't know what.
Okay.
It's reserved for industrial, scientific, or something.
So somebody uses it.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Okay. Almost perfect. Everybody said 1, 6, and 11. So that, remember our magic number is 5. for non-overlapping channels. 1, 6, and 11 are 5 apart. What technology do wireless LANs use to determine when they can gain access to the wireless media? Okay, everyone said CSMA-CA, and that is correct. What IEEE 802.11 variant supports a maximum speed of 54 megabits per second and uses the 2.4 gigahertz band? Okay, majority says 802.11g. That is correct.
Told you.
Yep, that was C. The answer was C. Which of the following is used by 802.11n to achieve high throughput through the use of multiple antennas for transmission and reception? Alright, the answer was a MIMO. Almost everybody got that right. Multiple input, multiple output. So that's the multiple antennas. A wireless LAN formed directly between wireless clients without the use of a wireless access point is referred to as what type of LAN? Okay, the answer to that one was an IBSS. Most of you got that right. On page 279, a wireless LAN can be created without the use of an access point. Such a configuration called IBSS is used for ad hoc. When extending the range for a 2.4 gigahertz wireless LAN, you can use non-overlapping channels for adjacent coverage cells. However, there's some overlap in coverage between those cells, so what percentage of that is recommended? Okay, majority says 10 to 15%. That is correct. If a wireless LAN does not require a user to provide credentials to associate with a wireless access point, A says the wireless
Yeah, I was like, what?
I don't know what that's supposed to be. What type of authentication is said to be in use? We don't need any credentials.
It's supposed to be access.
Access. I'll change that. Okay, if we don't need any credentials, then that is an open network. Most of y'all said open. Remember the SSID is the service set identifier. It's the name of the network. It's how you determine which one is which. And web is, you do need credentials, it's just weak credentials. So that's why we don't use it. WEP's RC4 approach to encryption uses a 24-bit string of characters added to the transmitted data, such that the same plain text data frame will never appear as the same web encrypted data frame. What is this string of characters called? Okay, most of y'all said A, initialization vector. That's correct. Last one. What standard developed by the Wi-Fi Alliance implements the requirements of 802.11i? It's for another textbook. Very good. Answer was WPA2. Almost everybody got that. All right. So that's it for me. We've got Chapter 7-8 Pearson quiz and test outs for this week. So go ahead and start working on those. If you have any questions, let me know.